Hello, my name's Roisin and welcome back to my channel. So you might notice I've had a little channel name change. Yes, that is how you spell Roisin. I just decided, since I talk about books far more than I talk about my chronic illness, this name made a little more sense. Anyway, today we are going to talk about magical realism because, well, for one thing, this time of the year all I want to read about is magical and the uncanny, so magical realism seemed like the perfect topic for a video essay at this time. And then also because I feel like magical realism is a term that gets bandied around here on BookTube quite a lot, but my fellow booktubers don't often define what it is. It's a fairly popular genre, if you can even call it a genre, we'll get into that later, but one that I think can cause a little confusion. What, for example, is the real difference between magical realism and urban fantasy? Or magical realism and light fantasy, surrealism, fabulism, even horror or just straight up fantasy? Beyond the fact that genre boundaries tend to be blurry, and a lot of books are quite hard to categorise, I think that magical realism is one of the phrases that is hardest to define in literature. When researching for this video, I discovered that hardly any scholars actually agree about where the genre boundaries lie. So it's no wonder that lay people like us can be a little confused. And on top of that, there is also the argument about place. Many of the most famous magical realists, writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Isabel Allende, are from Latin America. And there are debates among scholars and readers as to whether magical realism is a geographically bounded genre. If we should endeavour to use other terms when we are talking about books that employ tropes that we would expect to find in magical realism, but where the writers are not from Latin America or from the Latin American diaspora. Or whether magical realism is like most other genres and can be found throughout world literature. It is a complex topic with lots of different opinions on it. So I am not going to come to any firm conclusions in this video. I am just someone who makes video essays on YouTube, not someone who has been studying this genre for years or someone who writes magical realism, and I am not Latin American either. I'm just going to talk about the genre, the history of the term, and what we think about when we think about magical realism, as well as some of the arguments both for and against considering it purely a Latin American genre. And you can make up your own mind. As always with my video essays, all of my sources are linked in the description, so feel free to go away and do your own reading and to disagree with absolutely anything that I say. So often in my video essays, I will leave a playlist to all of them linked in the cards above. I begin with a definition. I will try and give you one for magical realism, but I have discovered in my research that it is quite a slippery term, and an authoritative definition hasn't really been found. Whilst I will talk about elements that most of the works that we call magical realist share later on, to begin, let's just say that magical realism is about magic in the everyday. It is writing based in the author's real world, and I will get to why I use scare quotes around that later, in which elements of fantasy or surrealism are included but not exceptional. The writer, the narrator, and the characters treat the magical as if it is mundane. That is the definition that I am starting from, but there other scholars do have different definitions which are more or less inclusive, adding more or fewer requirements to consider a work magical realist. But I think that this works as a good starting point for our discussion. Alongside the definition, we can also talk about the history of the term and of the movement. Of course, the idea of interweaving the magical and the real has a very long history in literature. From the epic poetry of ancient Greece, chivalric medieval traditions, and honestly in most mythology throughout the world. We have 1001 Nights or the Decameron, and on into Victorian Gothic literature. So while the use of the magical to explore the liminal edges of our own world is nothing new, the use of the term magical realism and the mode of writing can be traced back to the early 20th century. The term itself was coined by German critic Frederick Rowe in relation to visual art, to portray the magical nature of the rational world and the uncanniness of people within it. He coined the term Magical Realism, which I will not attempt to butcher, as I never studied German. And although he was referencing visual arts, at the time it was also used to describe literature such as Kafka's Metamorphosis, which had been published in 1915. Magical realism has been said to be both a subset of and a reaction to realism proper, an artistic movement which began in the 19th century with the works of Gustave Courbet as a reaction to the beautiful landscapes and exaggerated emotions of Romanticism. So realism was this, as opposed to this. After the 1848 French Revolution, more exact representations of reality came to be preferred. The poor were not cleaned up, the fruit was left to rot. This exact representation of reality then came to be taken up in literature as well. For example, in the works of George Eliot, such as Middlemarch, where the characters speak in vernacular English and even their most mundane daily tasks are described. Magic realism, or magical realism, of course departs from this strict adherence to reality by adding fantastical elements. But aside from the magic, the world that magical realists are describing is much the same as the realist one. It is often written very close to our own and details the lives of the poor and downcast, and marginalised in the same uncleaned up way. It is also therefore related in some ways to Surrealism, an art and literary movement that also came out of the early 20th century as a reaction to realism. Many of the early magical realists, such as Carpentier and Pietri, visited the salons of Paris in the 20s and 30s and became acquainted with the Surrealists. But while Surrealism uses magical elements to explore the subconscious and the psychology of its characters, magical realism hews closer to realism by focusing on the material and actual existence in the world, rather than the subconscious. Rowe's book, in which the term
Magical Realism
was first coined, was first translated into Spanish in 1927, coinciding with the period in the 1920s and 30s when many Latin American writers spent time in Berlin and Paris. And within a year of the translation, the term magical realism was being applied to the prose of writers in the literary circles of Buenos Aires. It also coincided with the Italian writer Massimo Bontempelli, who was a fascist, writing what is seen to be as the first intentional piece of magical realism in literature in 1926, which also influenced Belgian realist writers Johan Deisner and Hubert Lampeau. Venezuelan writer Arturo Uslar Pietri knew these men and was also influenced to write magical realist short stories in the early 1930s and on up until the 40s, and was perhaps the first to adopt the term realismo magico in Spanish in 1948. We then begin to hear of writers such as Miguel Ángel Asturias, a Guatemalan poet, and Alejo Carpentier, a Cuban novelist, who would start to talk of magical realism or the marvelous realism whenever given the opportunity to do so towards the end of the 1940s. At this point, magical realism goes from being a mode of writing discussed in salons to a literary movement. Among critical and scholarly circles, the term magical realism is often applied to works that combined Rowe's theories with French surrealist concepts of the marvellous and with the indigenous mythologies of the Americas. In 1955, critic Ángel Flores wrote the article Magical Realism in Spanish-American Fiction, and is often cited with turning the attention of the rest of the literary world onto the work of these Spanish-speaking Latin American writers. It is he who named Jorge Luis Borges as the first magical realist writer, although Borges himself rejected the term. And this of course ignores some of the writers with whom we've just become familiar. Flores draws a distinction between the magical realism of Europe in the 1920s and 30s and the magical realism of Spanish-speaking Latin America. While some praise Flores for opening the world's attention to Latin American literature, others accuse him of outlandish and patronising claims, such as when he says of pre-magical realist Latin American fiction, "The conditions of life are so difficult that they are unable to devote the time and travail required for all memorable achievements, with the result that their output is heterogeneous and often careless." He also purposefully ignores Brazilian contributions to the genre by focusing only on those writers who write in Spanish. The boom period of magical realism then came to Latin America in the 60s and 70s, beginning with the publishing of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The 60s and 70s were an era which combined the international acclaim for Latin American writers with the political turbulence of the Cold War and America's interventionism into Latin America during the Dirty Wars. As we will discuss in a minute, politics plays a very important role in magical realism. So hopefully you just got a decent overview as to the history of magical realism as a term. But is it a genre? As I said in the beginning, magical realism is a slippery phrase, one which can mean all things to all people. But there are some things which are generally agreed to be part of magical realism, and which most works which fall under this umbrella will include to some extent. The first of those is, of course, magic. Louis Leal said, "If you can explain it, then it is not magical realism. In all magical realist texts, something uncanny is afoot. Babies born with wings, eggs hatching rubies, rain falling as stars. And alongside the magical events, other dreamlike elements are included. Time is not linear and often skips ahead in the form of premonitions. The dead do not rest easy and often wander the earth. But while any of these things could conceivably happen in any fantasy novel, the key point of magical realism is that the magic is tied to the real. We are in a mundane setting and the tone is realistic. Authors are using magical elements to reveal the strange, uncanny, or fantastical in our own world. The magic is almost a sort of metaphor, although for the characters in the novels it is quite real. Magical realism often draws on indigenous fables and folklore, or that of the African and other diasporas, and weaves them into contemporary settings where the magical or fantastical elements are not more outlandish than the things that are recognisable from our own world. And this is often part of the point. One of the reasons that magical realism is a tool often employed in post-colonial literature, because it is a reaction to realism and Enlightenment ideals of what can be rationally explained. Realism sets itself up as objective and universal, but it is in fact Eurocentric and politically created. Magical realism requires readers to scrutinise the accepted realistic convention. For our characters, the magic may actually be real, but there is no real need to label or distinguish between real and magical. The texts often draw upon very real cultural traditions, using mystery, empathy, and non-Western myths and legends and ways of seeing. In addition to the magic being treated as unremarkable by our narrator, it is also unexplained. Unlike in urban or light fantasy, where our main characters are often outsiders, requiring the magic to be explained to them, or else there is some tension between whether there is a real or supernatural explanation for events. In magical realism, the fantastic is left unexplained simply because it is seen as mundane. You wouldn't explain the concept of lunch in a realist novel, so too you do not explain why the old man happens to have wings in a magical realist novel. We must simply accept it because Gabriel Garcia Marquez says it is so. We as readers must let go of our pre-existing ideas, both in terms of reality and in terms of conventional exposition, plot that moves somewhere, linear time. These things are seen as entirely unimportant. So outside of the fact that magical realist novels include both elements of the magical and the realist, most magical realist books also contain two other important elements. The first was one that in my research was often called the Baroque, or plenitude. This basically refers to the style of writing that means that magical realist novels use a lot of descriptive detail and lyrical or poetic language. Like a Baroque painting, there is an abundance of disorienting detail. The world is so rich and full, which adds to the realism of the novel. Nothing is beneath our notice. Like in the beginning, when I discussed Rowe's invention of the term to refer to visual arts, meaning an artwork which is so real that that fact in itself becomes strange. This huge array of overfilled detail and chaos can overwhelm a reader, leaving us feeling as though we have been spun around a few too many times. We don't know what it is that is important for us to focus on and what is just superfluous detail. Plenitude overwhelms us to the point where we have to suspend our disbelief. Sure, he's got wings now, fine, is kind of the response that the magical realist writer is going for. Some writers also talked about a specific American Baroque, meaning the Americas, not USA, and how that relates to a post-colonial Latin American atmosphere, where there is already so much that is lost in translation between different cultures, and so many layers of belief and mythology, traditional and ritual, so much extraordinary, strange and complex all layered together, and a layering of inharmonious opposites between urban and rural, Western and indigenous, so that it is easy for someone to feel off-kilter. And so naturally this feeling extends to the literature of the place as well. And the other important element that makes a work magical realist is political or social commentary. This magical mundane, this Baroque explosion of detail is usually used by magical realist writers to make a commentary, to expose what is strange or off-kilter about our reality. I've often heard it said by comedians in recent years, when politics is this strange, what does satire have to offer? Magical realism takes this same question, exposing what is surreal or fantastical about our own world through the use of the magical mundane. Magical realism is a genre often used by writers breaking away from the privileged centres of literature, and the work is revolutionary. Just as the magic causes us to scrutinise what is realistic in fiction, it also causes us to question what is accepted as natural in the political and social world of the realist side of magical realism. So now we've talked about what magical realism is, I wanted to mention what magical realism isn't. At the start of this video, I mentioned several different genres that magical realism is often confused with, or words that people try to use instead. But none of those things are the same as magical realism. They are different from magical realism and also different from one another. So let's begin. I've mentioned a few ways already that magical realism is different from fantasy. For example, in magical realism, our characters always live in the same world as our writer and usually the reader. The only difference being the magical things that happen. Now, of course, fantasy is a huge genre, one in which there are many subgenres, and not all of them involve being sucked into a fairy realm or trudging through Middle-earth. There are fantasies that are set in our world. Light fantasy and urban fantasy both usually describe works set in our world, with fantasy elements. But the other difference, as I've already mentioned, is that in magical realism, the magic is never explained. There is no world building because the world is our world. Not one like ours, but with magic. It is the exact same world. And the magical or fantastical elements are treated as if they need absolutely no explanation. There also aren't really magical creatures often in magical realism. No fairies or vampires or unicorns for the most part. There are often ghosts, but ghosts were real people. And we do talk metaphorically about ghosts all the time, about being haunted by something or loved ones looking down on us from the beyond. The magic in magical realism is often a metaphor pushed to the most extreme degree. And this magic, as I said, is drawn from the texture of the ordinary world to make a socio-political critique. Fantasy, of course, can be political, but there is no requirement that it has to be. The other words that often get used in place of magical realism are surrealism and fabulism. Both surrealism and magical realism explore non-literal aspects of humanity. And as I mentioned in the history of magical realism, they do have a historical connection with one another. They share a common ancestor, if you will, and spring from a similar impulse. But whereas magical realism is grounded in the real world, surrealism is focused on the inner life, imagination, and psychology. Magical realism makes reality more. It stretches what is real until metaphor springs to life. Whereas the surrealists go beyond reality and into the subconscious. Fabulism, on the other hand, refers to fables, parables, and myths. While a lot of magical realism does come from myth, particularly indigenous myth, as I talked about, it is not a requirement. The word fabulism comes from fable, and it can only be used to describe works that borrow elements from specific myths, fairy tales, and folk tales. The details are from well-known stories, not general magical elements. So, whilst I understand the impulse to describe works that use magical realist elements but don't come from Latin American tradition as fabulism, it doesn't really work as that term. They aren't interchangeable. Fabulism is also, for the most part, non-political and focused on the human experience, which is also where it differs from magical realism. As I mentioned at the beginning, the other way that scholars define magical realism is geographically. Magical realism belongs to Latin America. Some scholars are even more specific and say it belongs to one movement, one time period in the literary history of Latin America, namely from the late 40s to the early 70s, although every scholar disagrees about when the specific start and end point are. Now, as I said, I'm not going to fall one way or the other on this argument because I am a classic Libra and can see the points on both sides. But I will lay out the arguments for you to make your own mind up. As I mentioned at the beginning, magical realism was not a term coined in Latin America, and it was used to describe several European writers before it became associated with Latin American literature. I mentioned Franz Kafka earlier, but it has also been applied to Gogol, although this was a posthumous application since he was writing in the early 19th century and the term did not come into use until the early 20th century. Despite this, there are still many reasons for associating magical realism with Latin America, as in these historical beginnings, the word was first used for visual arts. There was often a confusion between what was magical realism and what was surrealism. Many of the elements that we consider to be intrinsic to magical realism only really came to the fore when it changed as it was transferred to the Americas. In Kafka's Metamorphosis, for example, Gregor is very surprised by the fact that he is turned into a beetle, although his parents and family treat it as if it is normal. Irene Gunther says, It is in Latin America that it was primarily seized by literary criticism and was through translation and literary appropriation transformed. Angel Flores, who I mentioned earlier, introduced the English-speaking world to Spanish magical realism, and he claims there is a historical precedent too. Magical realism is a continuation of the Romantic realist tradition of Spanish literature, and many of the most famous writers of magical realism are Latin American. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Isabel Allende, Jorge Luis Borges, Alejo Carpentier, Julio Cortázar, Mario Vargas Llosa, etc. And many of them claim magical realism for Latin America. Alejo Carpentier, who we mentioned earlier, was one of the earliest magical realists in Spanish, and claimed magical realism was a natural fit for the Americas because indigenous communities did not draw a fixed line between the natural and the supernatural. Gabriel Garcia Marquez said, "Surrealism comes from the reality of Latin America, and the political aspect of magical realism is important here too. For the politics most often expressed are a post-colonial statement of independence and of tradition outside of Europe. It was often used to tell stories of those on the fringes of society." Some writers and critics see the adoption of magical realism into the literary mainstream as cultural appropriation. Western scholars often try to group magical realism with postmodern writers. But because magical realism is part of the regional literary identity, and because it functions as a literature of the oppressed, some believe it cannot be lumped in with a larger movement. There are, of course, those who disagree, and for many reasons. One is that Latin American writers are not the only writers who use magical elements to discuss post-colonial and independence politics. Salman Rushdie, for example, wrote Midnight's Children with the same magic of the mundane to explore the political and magic that is unexplained, to tell his story of the history of India and of partition. He is grappling with similar ideas and using similar techniques to the Latin American magical realists. The same is true of the work of Toni Morrison, talking about the horrors of slavery. Both of these writers were also writing after the Latin American magical realist boom, but the method is similar. There is also the feminist argument that the Latin American magical realist boom is very male-centric. And although one of the most famous magical realist writers is a woman, Isabel Allende, she is writing after this boom period. Many feminist writers have used those same elements for political ends. Toni Morrison for both post-colonial and feminist politics, but also Virginia Woolf, Angela Carter, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, all challenge the idea of Hispanic supremacy in magical realism. And the inclusion of American indigenous myth as a part of magical realism, it seems remiss not to talk of the indigenous American writers who use magical elements in the same way, such as Louise Erdrich, N. Scott Momaday, and Leslie Silko. Another reason that people have against claiming Latin America as the sole place for magical realism is that they see it as having been used to force even the most disparate authors into a pigeonhole. Putting together authors on the basis that they use fantastical elements and come from Latin America, despite the fact that they wrote in different periods with different aesthetics and from different political perspectives, and also ignoring Latin American writers who don't use fantastical elements. Jorge Volpi said, "It has erased all of Latin America's previous explorations and become a choke chain for writers uninterested in magic. They claim it is a juggling of exoticism and legibility, Orientalist, a marketing plot and crude simplification. Something that can be seen in the opening of Netflix's Narcos. And the 2010s tourism campaign, Colombia is Magical Realism. Argentinian writer Fernando Strigotti acknowledges that the connection between Latin American literature and the fantastical is not out of left field. The problem for him is the European bent of this terminology, reducing Latin American literature to a reaction to an encounter with the European colonizer. Overall, it is impossible to argue that magical realism has absolutely nothing to do with Latin America. Many famous writers originated there, and it is where the boom of the movement happened. But whether it is exclusive to that area seems to be a more contentious issue. If you have any comments or anything I missed in my reading, I would love it if you would leave those below. It's an interesting debate, one that seems kind of hard to find the answer to. And since this month, for my Read Around the World challenge, I will be reading from writers from Spanish-speaking Latin America. I'm sure I will come straight into this debate about magical realism and writers who perhaps don't use it. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and perhaps know a little bit more about magical realism than you did when it started. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you did like it and to subscribe. I put out new videos twice a week, and so I should hopefully see you very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye. Life is but a dream. Westerners and but it has also been applied